I'm making an album that's also a game. I've made some videos criticizing games and expressing my hopes for the quality of games to improve, but it's a lot easier to say these sorts of things than to actually put them into practice. So I've decided to potentially prove myself equally incapable of creating anything of value by trying my hand at making a video game. I suppose if I fail, you can all laugh until I go back to just pointing out other people's failures. I'm also a musician and I like to write more with full albums in mind rather than just individual songs. But in the digital age, and especially in the era of streaming services, people tend to just listen to individual tracks on playlists. And even for those who still listen to whole albums, the experience is somewhat diminished without a physical record with art and liner notes and all that. So I've been thinking for a while about ways to make albums a similar experience, but on a digital platform. I also have a lot more experience with writing and recording music than with game development, so I feel that half of the process being something I'm more familiar, skilled, and experienced with will help keep my morale high while working through the learning curve of a new mode of creativity. That is not to say I'm just touching game development for the very first time, though. Several years ago, I was working the 3 a.m. shift at Dunkin' Donuts, and during that time my manager, who had a wife and kids, would make out with the manager of the Dunkin' Donuts down the road, who was not his wife, in the one corner of the building that was out of the sight of the security cameras. Needless to say, I didn't remain at that job for very long. By the grace of the Lord above, I got another job right away, but my first day wasn't for a couple of weeks, so I needed something to do during that time. I knew if I didn't decide on some creative project to get obsessed with, I would just end up playing video games and feeling that I had wasted the 2 weeks. So I decided to make a compromise with myself and to learn how to make video games on YouTube for my productive activity. Thus, a week of Bracky's videos commenced. At the end of the first week, I excitedly showed my wife, then my girlfriend, the game at which I had been slaving away for hours each day. It consisted of 3 levels of a red ball rolling past obstacles. The entire game could be played in about 2 minutes. Showing her the game felt like a reenactment of the Parks and Recreation scene where Ben shows Chris his claymation video, and it was a lot shorter than he expected it to be for all the work he put into it. I spent the next week trying to work through Bracky's RPG tutorial, and I was working with an old MacBook that very quickly displayed its limits. Once I started my new job, I left Unity behind for a while. It wasn't until a couple years later that I was randomly struck with inspiration for a video game. But I still had the same laptop that could hardly even handle opening Unity. So I once again spent a couple weeks in Unity until my laptop could no longer handle it. This time, determined not to give up yet again, I impulsively decided to sell my laptop and PS4 and use the money to buy a gaming laptop. But then I started a full-time job and shortly after started working full-time on a master's degree at the same time. This brings us to the present day, in which I am still working full-time at both a job and on that same master's degree. Oh, and I got married as well. But despite having a lot to do, I have a continual itch to work on some kind of creative project. I have an accumulation of years' worth of video game ideas that I need to at least attempt to have displayed on a screen, or else I feel I'll implode. This past Christmas, I had a few days off and decided to spend a couple hours each day making actual progress on a game, and it happened. It was a small step for mankind, but a leap for myself. And for months now, I've actually been making progress. To keep up the momentum, I've decided to start a devlog, which you're watching now. So my initial idea, based on recommendations given by various game developers on YouTube, was to make a small crappy game to start out. My small crappy game idea was basically just a small explorable open world to accompany an album of music that would really be the main focus. My first idea was just to make all the assets in the game billboarding 2D sprites, like in Doom or Daggerfall, and to just animate characters from medieval paintings and illuminated manuscripts instead of designing them myself. I wanted it to kind of feel like you had become a character in a book, and were exploring its illustrations that had become a kind of pop-up book open world. But I soon discovered that Unreal Engine, to which I had switched for its better open world tools, for some reason does not allow you to have a 2D billboard that only turns on one axis. And when I made a billboarding effect manually, it was more expensive than I was expecting. So I decided to move back to Unity and start over. But at this point, I felt like Goldilocks, and the porridge in Unity was not to my liking either. Having become accustomed to the open world tools of Unreal, switching to Unity felt super limiting. Billboarding worked a lot better, but that was pretty much the only thing I felt Unity had going for it. So I decided at this point I would abandon the 2D sprites idea and instead achieve the mix of 2D and 3D I wanted through cell shading and Sobel edge detection. And this style actually worked a lot better with getting a style that's more similar to the two primary inspirations for the look I wanted for the world, which are Russian illustrator Ivan Bilibin and Scottish painter John Duncan. So I've moved back to Unreal, and I'm feeling pretty happy about how things are looking now. In terms of the concept for the game, as always happens with my creative projects, it has quickly become more ambitious than I can probably entirely accomplish. For some reason, I like to make things as hard for myself as possible, so the concept is expanded to an open-world fantasy RPG, with a full branching story arc, various factions, combat, magic, and music systems, and a more expansive map that changes dynamically according to the music, because at least I've still maintained the initial video game album part of the original idea. In terms of the music, I've got a handful of songs that are already pretty far along, since, being primarily a musician, that comes a lot more easily to me. I've been feeling pretty influenced by the extended structures of progressive rock and krautrock music from the 70s, especially longer tracks by bands like Pink Floyd, Yes, and Can. Some of the main staples of influence in all the music I make are MGMT, Animal Collective, The Flaming Lips of Montreal, Stereolab, and Radiohead. I'm planning to make 2 versions of each track, slightly shorter versions that will add up to a normal album length, which I'll release on their own on streaming platforms, and then extended versions that will be in the game. My idea is that the songs will themselves sort of be playable, and that there will be certain corresponding game content appearing in the open world that's only accessible while that particular track is playing. And I plan for the mix and arrangement of each track to have slight variations depending on where you are in the map. In this way, it will hopefully feel like the music and game are one experience rather than 2 separate things happening at the same time. So basically, to sum it up succinctly, I guess you can think an Elder Scrolls kind of game with a Sable meets Bilibin art style, a sort of story and world that's heavily influenced by the books of William Morris, and a game that's overall a similar experience to watching The Wizard of Oz while listening to The Dark Side of the Moon. That's basically what I'm going for. Will I be able to accomplish all of this? I guess we'll see. I suppose you can like and subscribe and all that if you want to find out. Anyway, that's all I've got so far. I'll call this devlog number 0, since this was mostly an introduction. I'm sure I'll have more interesting stuff to show you next time, at least I hope. But okay, goodbye now.